It's 12 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Mary Furlong-Minkoff. I'm the Assistant Director and Curator of Archaeological Collections here at Montpelier. And I am really excited about the program we have today. Before
turn up, I can't hear it.
Before we get too far into it, the first thing I'm going to do is ask people to mute themselves if you haven't done that already. And then if you have a question at any point, you can feel free to put it in the chat, raise your hand, and there's definitely going to be time at the bottom to answer questions. So I want to go ahead and introduce Liz. So Elizabeth McCague, who started at Montpelier many years ago, and we renamed her Liz, much to her own chagrin. But Elizabeth McCague is now a doctoral candidate at the University of Maryland in College Park in the Department of Anthropology. She earned her BA in Anthropology with minors in Museum Studies and African Diaspora Studies from St. Mary's College of Maryland in 2015. She was trained in historical archaeology while working at St. Mary's, conducting fieldwork in the Gambia, West Africa, Jamaica, and at plantation sites in Southern Maryland. And following her undergraduate degree, Liz was employed here at James Madison's Montpelier in Central Virginia as an archaeologist and a crew chief until 2018, where she worked on the excavations of domestic slave quarters, smokehouses, trashmen's, kitchens, ice house. If you worked in the South Yard at some point, you probably worked with Liz. Her research interests include public archaeology, plantation landscapes, racial capitalism, multi-species entanglements, and her research focuses on equestrian labor practices surrounding the horse industry at James Madison's Montpelier. And she likes farmers markets, traveling, gardening, and Pokemon Go. And I just want to put a very special thank you to her for being willing to do this. We're really excited to have Liz give this presentation. It's just another example of when we say, you know, once you come on a program, your family, well, she came on a field school. We didn't let her leave the property for years. And then once she finally got away, she's still doing research on our behalf. So I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for being here. It's so great to see so many faces in the audience. Today I prepared a roughly 35 minute presentation on my research on historic horses in the archaeological record, including my dissertation research to date, as well as a project I'm working on with my advisor.
One goes one way, one goes the other way.
And longtime Montpelier collaborator,
Right up here, fill it.
Barnett Zuckerman.
Hey, push one way and one the other way.
So turn it down.
For a little background on me, I'm a former horse girl and equestrian, and also a former Montpelier archaeology employee, as Mary just said. I was at Montpelier as an intern, a staff archaeologist, and eventually crew chief when I was there from 2015 to 2018. I'm currently a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland, College Park. It was during my time at Montpelier that my interest in the archaeology of equestrian life sparked, when we recovered horse-related artifacts in the Grove, by the entrance to the Temple Ice House, and in metal detector hits across the property, ranging from the Madison to the DuPont era. I was fascinated by the material culture we were finding in the archaeological record at Montpelier. However, I found little written on the subject of horse-related material culture outside of a few key scholars, such as Sarah Rivers-Cofield at the Mac Lab in Southern Maryland, who works with small finds related to equestrian culture. Within her work, Rivers-Cofield draws connections between horses and material culture that were used as status symbols in the past, something I find present at Montpelier, which I speak to in a moment. Her work sent me down my own path towards considering horses at plantation sites. What do we know about how horses were used, how they lived, what they ate, how they were trained, housed, bred, named, cared for, and who cared for them, who labored with them, for them, and because of them? There were and still are so many questions, with surprisingly little in the way of archaeological investigation to guide the way. But we have tools at our disposal to help illuminate these really interesting multi-species relationships in the historical and archaeological record. As a historical archaeologist with this interest in horse-related material culture and labor behind the horse industry, I have several tools that allow me to access the horses of the past and that help inform the archaeology. I'm going to use these tools as a guidepost throughout my talk today. I lean heavily on historical records, which you'll notice in the first half of my presentation, because there's so much potential for information from these documents, and that is currently where the majority of my efforts have been in grad school thus far. Paintings, books that planters owned on horse care and keeping, newspaper advertisements for runaway or stolen horses, and official records like wills and probates offer insights into the lives of horsemen and the horses they cared for. These records can be really useful, though they come with their own biases and hidden agendas, always to be read for, as I talk about later in this presentation. I'll go over the remaining 3 tools later in this talk, but for now, let's dive into the research. In order to learn more about horses and horse culture, I turned to the archives at Montpelier and those at the National Sporting Library and Museum in Middleburg, Virginia, for historical information about equines in Virginia. Through my archival research, I've come to understand a great deal about the use, perception, and symbolism of the horse in the 18th and 19th century. I've come to find that the horse use was highly influenced by its owner's position in society. A lower class farmer would use one horse for many purposes, while a wealthy planter was able to have a specific plow horse, a specific carriage horse, and a specific riding horse, likely several of each depending on the size of the plantation. I find that 18th and 19th century horses fit into 3 key roles. The first being an agricultural tool for use on the plantation and farms as cart and plow horses, used for hauling logs and ice, and clearing and plowing fields, as well as general manual labor. Next is transportation animals, used to get from one place to another for nearly all land-based travel in the 18th and early 19th century, whether by saddle or carriage, stagecoach, or cart. And last, as sporting animals, used for the sports of horse racing and fox hunting namely, but this also encompasses horses that were bred with highly manicured pedigrees, a common trend with the rise of thoroughbred horse racing, which I discuss in a moment. Though we don't have exact records pertaining to the use of each and every horse that lived or was bred at Montpelier, we can piece together the lives of these animals through correspondences about their use on and off the plantation by the Madison family. Here's one great example we have from a newspaper advertisement for James Madison's missing sorrel horse in 1779. We know that the Madisons employed horses for agricultural labor, primarily in the early years of the plantation. And we know that horses, often those referred to with names such as Tamerlane, Dragon, and Phyllis, were used for transportation, with some, like Tamerlane, who appeared to have multiple uses on the plantation. Though we can't definitively say whether or not Madison was breeding thoroughbreds for use in the booming horse racing industry, I would guess he was involved in horse racing in some capacity, especially given the quote by Paul Jennings claiming no jockey ever cheated him. Even if Madison was not actively racing horses, he was producing horses with highly manicured pedigrees. And what is interesting here is that he was referring to these animals, and he and others referred to these animals by their lineage, not by their intended purpose for the plantation or a planter. For example, we see broodmares referred to as being by driver, or the mare put to Clifton, as opposed to the name, color, or role on the plantation, indicating that their worth is based on their breeding to a well-known or well-bred stallion, not for their role as agricultural nor transportation animals in and of themselves. When we outline the quantity of horses taxed as being owned by James Madison Jr. by year and his political trajectory, we see some interesting trends. There is a noted increase in the quantity of horses listed under James Madison Jr.'s ownership over the course of his political career. For me, it is the year 1805 that is of particular interest because it is the first time we note that Madison possesses a stallion, likely to breed his own broodmares too. While we do not know the breed of the stallion, it is the same year that this quote emerges. Quote, "I have long regretted that in rearing horses, I have so long made use of inferior brood mares, particularly those not thoroughbred, to which fancy and fashion attach so much value, and shall in future endeavor to repair the error. James Madison Jr. to Isaac Winston, 1805. Following this, there was a noted increase of horses until the end of Madison's political career, peaking at the start of his presidency, after which we see a slight decline. In the late 18th, early 19th century came the rise of thoroughbred importation from Europe. Planters, politicians, and common folk were drawn to the horse racing scene, while horse owners became fascinated with the bloodlines of their horses, spending hundreds of dollars on stud fees, importations of stallions and broodmares, and the upkeep of these living machines and sporting animals. This all makes me wonder if James Madison Jr. came to possess a thoroughbred stallion in 1805 to increase his quantity of thoroughbred offspring. It appears to me that Madison was using thoroughbreds for a specific purpose. Thoroughbreds, while incredibly versatile animals, are bred for speed and are lighter than your typical workhorse that would be chosen for agricultural work. You'd expect stockier, heavier draft animals to be better suited. So what is Madison breeding thoroughbreds for? Not likely agricultural work, especially since he primarily switched his agricultural production to use oxen during his management of Montpelier. Transportation is possible, but an unlikely rationale behind these well-known horse racing pedigrees. I argue that this was more of a breeding venture that could have further political, economic, and social ramifications for Madison. This is something my dissertation research hopes to better understand in part. As Sarah Rivers Cofield's work at the Mac Lab has demonstrated, horses were also used as status symbols during this time based upon the appearance of horse and rider. To illustrate, we have evidence of James Madison being criticized in the press for his, quote, nitty-knotty carriage, end quote, part of which is pictured here and annotated on the right. This whole thing is kind of a gem to me, as it clearly describes the appearance of both types of Madison's carriages at the time, his carriage horses and their appearance, and the public association with certain features of these horses. Long tails, plain carriages, lack of check reins were associated with plow horses of an old Virginian farmer, a seemingly negative connotation, and not the President of the United States. Luckily, his more presidential-looking horse and carriage turned up soon after, noting that gray was a more appropriate color for horses of the president. Beautiful trim on the carriage, seemingly similarly important. It's important to think about how horse care and keeping even became possible in the 18th and 19th century, and that is primarily due to the expertise of enslaved horsemen, or enslaved laborers who were tasked with the care, keeping, jockeying, blacksmithing, and basic veterinary care for these animals. It wasn't obvious to me when I first started down this research journey, but it has since become abundantly clear that the equestrian world as it is known today in the United States owes a great debt to the enslaved horsemen who performed so much hidden labor in the horse world. On the plantation landscape, enslaved horsemen performed almost every role when it comes to the horse you can imagine, from daily care and feeding to training to racing. Enslaved laborers grew the feed fed to horses, but also hauled the water from wells for them to drink, performed veterinary care on the sick and injured animals, and prepared them for work each and every day. When we think about horse-related labor, it was certainly not the elite planters tending to the ill horse in the middle of the night, or being the first to get on a young, unbroken animal, or shoveling manure from the stalls. Enslaved horsemen knew these animals in a way that their owner could never achieve given their close relationships. And yet, to put it in perspective, enslaved laborers were listed alongside the value of horses in probate records. With the amount of money being poured into the sporting industry, to have the best thoroughbred horses in the country by elite white men, work with horses was a highly valued skill. Pictured here is an ad looking for 10 to 14-year-old boys to be taken as something of an apprentice to become horsemen. Learning how to train horses for the thoroughbred industry, the ad noting that it adds much to the value of an enslaved individual. Over the last few years, one of my goals has been to find evidence of Black horsemen in the archival record, which has proved to be enormously challenging because white horsemen, and white turfmen in particular, had status roles to maintain and would not have been eager to give credit to Black horsemen, as similarly depicted here in a sporting magazine, in which the author is asking for more training, more information on horse training, because otherwise they are compelled, quote, compelled to depend on ignorant Negroes, end quote, which just goes to show me that the whole industry relied so heavily on Black horsemen and their expertise. And I think this is just a really great example of that. Enslaved horsemen continued to be successful in the sporting industry through emancipation, with notable Black jockeys, including Isaac Murphy, pictured here, dominating the sport of horse racing until the Jim Crow era, when Black horsemen were harassed, attacked, and at times barred from participating in the sport. Through increased research on the lives and roles of Black horsemen, we are able to amplify their expertise and bring to light a hidden history of horsemanship in this country, one of my main goals for my dissertation. Turning our attention back to Montpelier, we are incredibly fortunate to have photographic evidence of the early 1900s at Montpelier, thanks in large part to the DuPont scrapbooks, a series of photos and newspaper clippings from the DuPont ownership of the property, dating from as early as the 1910s through the early 1980s. Under the DuPont ownership, the plantation property was re-envisioned as a sporting estate for equestrian life. This was part of a larger trend in which northern rich white people, i.e. the DuPonts from Delaware, who were also fleeing from family strife, would come to the South and purchase former plantations that were suffering for many reasons, but in large part due to the lack of free, forced, and coercive labor under enslavement. By repurposing the land as a sporting estate, as the DuPonts did with horseback riding and racing, through the addition of barns, stables, and racecourses, Northerners worked to wash their hands of the legacies of slavery across the South. Though we don't know the names of every horseman pictured in the scrapbooks, it is my hope that through interviews with Montpelier horsemen and their descendants, this may become possible, with the hope that we can better understand the lives of horsemen enslaved and free on the Montpelier plantation. Though there are many horsemen we do not know, we do know of Charles Smoot, pictured here, successful Black steeplechase rider from as early as 1916, who joined the Montpelier staff around 1930, becoming foreman, a position he kept until a few years before his death in 1979. In 1974, Marion DuPont Scott is quoted to have said, "Nobody could be better with horses than Charles is." Smoot was so integral to Marion DuPont Scott's racing industry that upon an attempt to bar him from a race due to the color of his skin, Marion threatened to pull her horses from the races unless Smoot was allowed to ride. The race judges allowed Smoot to ride, but it goes to show the rampant racism that was ongoing and impacting horsemen like Smoot during the DuPont ownership of Montpelier. But of course, there is still so much we do not yet know, hence why we must rely on other tools in the toolkit to better illuminate the lives and labor behind the horse industry. You'll see that thus far, I've utilized the historical record heavily, as my research to date has focused on archival and historical records. But to dovetail to my next portion of my talk, I want to talk about this really fascinating problem we have with equine skeletal remains, and that is that we rarely recover them. Myself and my advisor, Barnett Pavau-Zuckerman, are currently looking into a theory as to why this may be the case. Horses are fairly fragile animals, despite their size. They are prone to foot and leg injuries like abscesses, bowed tendons, laminitis, and breaks, which typically end their lives. Horses also require an enormous amount of labor to maintain, as we've discussed. So once a horse has injured itself beyond repair or has become no longer useful, planters were not likely to keep them around given their expense. While urban dwellers had the ability to deposit unwanted animals at rendering plant or a slaughterhouse, end-of-life care and disposal of horses at rural sites, and particularly on plantations, was very likely a local affair. Plantations in the 18th and 19th century strove for self-sufficiency, using the expertise of the enslaved blacksmiths and other craftsmen and women for the production of goods and services necessary to keep the plantation functioning. As horse care and keeping was performed by enslaved horsemen on the plantation in an era before veterinarians were common, we can assume that the grim but necessary task of putting down a sick or injured animal occurred on the property as well. So we could expect to find a few dead horses every now and again, or so you'd think. Interestingly, we do not have a lot of physical evidence of horse remains archaeologically. Historic horses were not being buried except in extremely rare cases, as pictured here, from Yorktown and Jamestown, the only two known historic horse burials in Virginia. Archaeologists generally attribute the absence of horse remains to their primary utility as work animals rather than as meat sources. While this may account for equid absence in food-related contexts such as kitchen middens alongside a cow and pig, it does not explain the underrepresentation of equids in non-food contexts such as in and around stables, barns, and fields, or across other areas of the plantation. So what happened to horses in death? We may have stumbled upon one possibility. During archival research at the National Sporting Library and Museum, I stumbled across multiple articles telling the story of an English stallion named Squirt, who was, quote, led out to the dog kennels. Described elsewhere as poor, despised, and death-doomed, Squirt was considered of so little value, undesirable, and good for nothing that he was on his way to the dog kennel with orders to be shot, when his life was spared by a sympathetic stud groom. This story grabbed my attention immediately and prompted a series of questions. Was this a common practice? Did this happen in the United States? Can we see this in the archaeological record? Well, a few days after my discovery of Squirt, I came across a period English artwork that backed up my dog kennel theory. The image depicts a dog kennel with 3 dogs, comparable to modern-day pit bulls, a man waving his hat at the dogs, and in the corner, a pile of bones, including a lower mandible and a femur consistent with equine. The combination of these historical records suggests that the practice of feeding horse remains to dogs was common in England, and we suggest that this very well may have happened here as well. Thanks to funding from the University of Maryland Graduate School, we have been able to explore this possibility using a big data approach, in which we hope to find out using a series of aggregate data whether we can see evidence of canine gnawing or consumption of equine remains, or if there are any other noticeable patterns to be seen within the end of life of these animals. So, since the summer of 2022, Barney and I have been collecting zooarchaeological data, some of it available online, some of it housed in these card catalogs pictured on the left from various archaeological repositories, labs, and zooarchaeologists across the Eastern Woodlands region broadly. Although we were most interested in observations on carnivore gnawing, we gathered all data on individual specimens, including species identification, element portion, fusion, butchering marks, gnaw marks, and other observations as reported. And it's been fairly successful so far, but we're always looking for more data sets. So if anyone out there knows of any, please get in touch. To give you an idea of what kind of skeletal or faunal remains that we're interested in, I'll show you a few examples. This distal tibia is sawn at one end, indicating human breakdown. But then we have carnivore gnawing on the ends, which you can see from the drag marks from tooth scraping on the surface, as well as crenulated edges at the end. We can also look for punctures that would be indicative of canine gnawing, like in the bottom left corner. But this is not to be confused with rodent gnawing, which looks more like this, with patches of parallel grooves. We're also interested in equine faunal remains that may have been digested by canines, like this bovine specimen. We are relieved and excited to report that carnivore gnawing is common in the 136 horse assemblages compiled to date. Gnaw marks are found on elements from across the skeleton, including not particularly meaty parts, such as the calcaneus and the distal phalanx. Even more frequent in the assemblages are hack marks. These marks appear mostly to be associated with primary butchery, as would be expected if horses were dismembered and broken down into manageable chunks before being fed to the dogs. Modifications in general were most common on the femur, radius, innominate, and tibia. These are slightly meatier portions, but not always the meatiest. Interestingly, cut marks, which are generally associated with removing meat from bone, are more frequent than anticipated. We did not anticipate high quantities of cut marks on horse specimens, given that they were not primarily a food animal for humans. Could this mean that some horses were stripped of meat prior to being tossed to the dogs? Future research will evaluate any correlation among hack, cut, and gnaw marks in the assemblages. From the combination of historical research and zooarchaeological data on carnivore-gnawed skeletal remains, we've been able to test our theory on this long-standing mystery in historical archaeology: where are all the dead horses? Though we are still working on data collection and analysis, we'd like to think that by the end of it, we'll be able to better understand the practices surrounding equine end of life in the Eastern Woodlands region, and possibly add the dog kennel disposal as another end of life practice for historical consideration. Back to our toolkit, and though I'm short on time, I want to quickly address the remaining tools. We have the ability to look at horse-related buildings to get a better understanding of how horses lived and were used on the property, and how buildings were used to alter human behavior on the landscape. Of course, if there are historic maps or extant structures on the property, stables and carriage houses are primary sources for understanding how horses lived in the 18th and 19th century. This is especially true when paired with archaeological data to better understand the combination of architectural footprints and the artifacts associated with these spaces. We also have an incredible array of horse-related buildings on the property left behind by the DuPont family, including the broodmare barn pictured here, which is now repurposed to house the horticulture department at Montpelier. Here we can note the extra wide stalls used for giving birth and housing the addition of a foal, and we can note that the manufacturing was by Sears and Roebuck, which indicates that this building, along with the 3 you see when leaving the property, were catalog ordered, train delivered, and the pieces of the barn were assembled on the property. The DuPonts also left behind a pony barn, stud barn, carriage house, quarantine barn, racing barns, a yearling barn, a flat race course, along with one of the last living natural fence steeplechase courses in the United States. Many of these buildings have been repurposed on the property, allowing for them to remain maintained and preserved for us to continue to learn from. In terms of archaeological landscape analysis, metal detector surveys being conducted across the property have been hugely successful in identifying horse-related sites. Though I really don't have time to get into it today, this metal detector survey map of the area behind the visitor center allowed for the identification of the Madison era stable on the property. As part of my master's research, I put together a virtual equestrian landscape tour of Montpelier, including the DuPont buildings, which can be viewed online and on mobile for anyone who is interested if you scan the QR code in the upper right-hand corner with your smartphone's camera app. I'll also have it at the end, and I can have Matt send out the link when the email comes out too. And last but not least, we have material culture, the archaeologist's bread and butter. Archaeology and material culture can help us understand the use of the horse and change over time through the study of their material culture. Saddle trees, stirrups, bits, buckles, curry combs, spurs, horseshoes, and horseshoe nails all have a good chance of surviving in the ground for us to study. We can look to see where these items are being found and analyze the objects for wear patterns, manufacture style, and modifications. The artifacts help inform what type of activity was occurring in a given area. So if we're finding larger horse or oxen shoes, chains, and possibly remnants of a large horse collar, we may presume that agricultural work was occurring in that area. Whereas if we find horseshoes, cut farrier nails, and an iron byproduct known as slag, we may presume that blacksmithing and farrier activity was occurring in that area. I'm only just in the beginning stages of looking at the material culture associated with equines and equine-related labor at Montpelier. Through my forthcoming material culture analysis, hopefully to begin this spring, I hope to better understand the labor and expertise behind the horse-related material culture we've recovered at Montpelier. I plan to ask questions about how they were made and used. How much were they worth? Were they being sold at the blacksmith shop or manufactured for plantation use? How did these objects change over time? And are there patterns in where we are finding them across the plantation landscape? To conclude, together these tools, historic records, skeletal remains of equines, architectural and landscape analysis, and material culture have the ability to come together to reveal more about the lives of enslaved horsemen and the equines they cared for across the plantation landscape. I look forward to adding material culture analysis and working in additional landscape analysis as tools in my toolkit and as pieces of evidence used to better understand this integral but often overlooked industry of the past, and to celebrate the expertise of enslaved blacksmiths and horsemen in the history of horsemanship in the United States. This research is still very much so in progress, and in some ways it's just beginning, so I would love to hear questions, comments, and leads for new avenues to explore along the way. I'd like to thank the Archaeology Department at Montpelier for inviting me to speak today, and for each and every one of you for coming along for the ride. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. And the questions are already coming. So if you want to unshare your screen, if you don't mind. There we go. Excellent. So if anybody has questions, feel free to put them in the chat or to raise your virtual hand, but we've already got one coming through in the chat from John Douglas Hall. And he asks, are there references available as to the names of the types of horses in Virginia / at Montpelier in the late 18th, early 19th century? Also, are there records of names of breeding animals, mares and studs in Virginia or Montpelier?
Yes. So one of the things I took on a few years ago was looking into the thoroughbred pedigree records that exist online, and thoroughbred people keep track of their bloodlines. And they're free to access as well. And I've actually found a couple horses through the thoroughbred pedigree records that are listed as being owned by Madison. And so we know that there were definitely thoroughbreds in the area. We also know that draft horses came in, but not, it was a little later. I'm not sure the exact year the drafts came in off the top of my head, but I can look that up for you. But we know that there were also Virginia or Chickasaw horses, as they were called, in terms of breeds. And these were referred to as kind of like small, stocky, kind of, we think that they were imported from the Spanish horse. They were originated from the Spanish horses that came into Florida and eventually just came up the eastern coast. So we do know that we don't have specific references to breeds in terms of Montpelier horses other than the thoroughbreds, but we do know that there was references to draft horses here, but in terms of specific breeds, not entirely sure.
Awesome. All right, I'm gonna go to Becca. She's got her hand up.
Oh yeah.
Hello, Liz. Oh, it's so nice to meet you virtually.
I know, you too.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was amazing, and it's just something I don't know anything about. So thank you.
Thank you.
I was wondering, so I don't know if this is like a lie or not. My grandmother used to tell me that, like Jello or the stuff that's in Jello comes from like horse bones or horse hooves or something like that. Could that have been a practice, do you think, here on Madison's plantation? And if so, would it have been, do you think rather, would it have been used by the enslaved or found its way up the chain to, Madison's table?
That's a great question, and something I've been considering too. So if we see these horses are being stripped of meat, maybe their hooves are being collected for creation of gelatinous Jello, but in terms of if we have that in the cooking records, I'm not sure. Like I'd have to talk to Hillary about if there is any references to Jello or anything like that in the Madison records, because that would be something I'm going to write that down because I would really love to know that. But it's definitely possible. I think there were a lot of different ways to repurpose a horse, and I think that we know that at least in Europe, horse hair, and in the States, horse hair was collected for a number of different reasons, stuffing pillowcases, used in lime and mortar, and so I can say it would be a potential, but it's not something I found direct evidence of yet.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I'm going to look into the Jello thing.
Great. Matt, you had your hand up next.
Yeah. Hey, Liz, great presentation.
Thank you.
Would the presence of, first, what's the most common context for the horse remains that you all have found in the archaeological context? Like what sort of sites? And it's obviously kind of a circular logic, but could the presence of horse remains be indicative of dogs at those sites as well, inversely? Because I don't know what other kind of canine or what other kind of carnivore would be big enough or chewing in horses.
Right. Yeah. So we would think that well, so most of the context that we were using for this study we tried to pick rural sites just because we know that urban sites had more potential to end up with horses at rendering plants or a slaughterhouse. And so we were trying to target rural sites just because where else are these horses being disposed of on rural sites? And so that's our primary goal, but we do have a couple city sites in our collection, but for the most part, they were rural. And then in terms of if it would be indicative of dogs, if we have the carnivore gnawing, then possibly. But I mean, it could be, you know, coyote or, you know, other canines in the area. But we would like to think that could indicate one way or the other.
Do you know if it were the sites homes of enslaved? Were they larger trash deposits associated with the main house? Were they work areas?
Gotcha. So no, we don't have that. We have the information from all the sites, but we were just looking for horses anywhere. So we would love to kind of pin down more like plantation enslaved sites in the future, but for right now, horse remains are just so hard to come by on archaeological sites that we were just looking for any and all horse we could get our hands on from the Eastern Woodlands region from like 16th century to 19th century. So it's a really big data approach, but we're trying to see if we can kind of figure out these end-of-life practices as a group using these disparate collections.
All right, I'm going to hop to the chat because this sort of builds and connecting to dogs. Leslie asks, hey, Leslie, have you looked into archaeological kennel sites in England at hunting estates? That might show evidence of this practice of horses being used to feed the dogs.
Yes, and interestingly, I gave a similar talk when we first started this this dog kennel theory to the Equine History Collective, which is a group of equine history nerds, and they talked about how in England the practice of feeding horses to dogs was really common at hunting estates, and so that's kind of what gave us the fuel to think, okay, well, if this was happening over in the UK, could this be happening over in the United States as well? And so I've actually reached out to a number of fox hunting estates, a couple here and there in Virginia, to see if anybody still practices the feeding horses to dogs, because it was considered actually a good death for the horse to be fed to fox hunting dogs, because it kind of returns them back to the sport in which they love so much, apparently. And nobody got back to me in terms of if they still feed the horses to dogs.
Actually, I know they do. I put in a question about that, but up in Middleburg, a couple of the hunts, they absolutely request that older horses or horses that have to be put down are fed to the hounds. And let me just throw this in as a really fine point, but if you don't want to piss off fox hunting people, don't call them dogs. They are hounds.
Yes, very true, very true. And thank you. Dogs. And I would love to talk more to you about this if you're willing. I would love to hear more about the Middleburg practice, because like I said, I reached out, you know, hi, it's kind of weird. I'm an archaeologist. I'd love to talk to you about if you feed your horses to the hounds, and no one responded. So I would love to talk to you about it if you're willing.
Yeah, no, because I've belonged to many hunts in my life, and I know over at Keswick, you could talk to the huntsman, Paul, and I could give you his contact number. He would be happy to talk to you as long as you call them hounds.
Of course.
Also, Bull Run is near here. But my question was, because I've seen photos up in DuPont, you know, of Marion DuPont's father's grandfather, et cetera, hunting to hounds on this property. But I didn't know if they had their own private pack of hounds or if they hunted with another hunt, because Bull Run is near here. And Martha Strother hunts with Bull Run, I know, so she might be able to help you there.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
But thank you so much.
Yeah.
the DuPonts did have their own hounds, and I don't know as much about the. I bet if Betsy was here, I'd call him Betsy. She's the hound expert. So there were the hounds that the DuPonts had, and I know that they fox hunted on the property extensively, and so I have to wonder what happened to the DuPont horses as well. But I think at that time they may have had rendering services in place. But
Yeah, I mean,
we
she was such a horse lover that I would have thought that she would have buried, you know.
We have the 3 horse burials of Battleship, Annapolis, and Accra, I believe. And but the other than the 3, I'm not sure exactly where the rest ended up.
Yeah.
And Liz, just so you know, Elizabeth Boylan is in charge of events at Montpelier now. So
You can reach me here.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Vivian, you have your hand up.
Well, Liz, I'll tell you right now, I know for a fact that they're still taking horses to feed the hounds because my first one went there after dying in a field accident.
No way.
And my second one is buried on the property.
Wow.
Say that. So I have 2.
Okay. So yeah.
They were saying that they also would take their hooves and anything that had like collagen in them and boil it down to use for help make glue. You heard of sending them to the glue factory?
Exactly.
I threatened them with packing them off in itty bitty cans.
Thank you, Vivian. That's awesome to know that that's still happening. And so
it's still happening.
Yeah, we're just trying to find out more about it because, like I said, this mystery has been plaguing us. You know, where are the horse remains? And we're thinking this might be reason, but not sure.
As Elizabeth was saying, go to the hunt clubs.
Yes.
You'll probably find a pile there.
Yeah.
Either that or you might find them at PetSmart or someplace like that too.
Yeah.
Some other kind of ideas coming through in the chat is thinking about use in metallurgy fertilizer. Also, Jerome, as a furniture maker, says, look where they're getting their hide glue. That's a really great idea.
Yes. Thank you, Jerome.
We also have a question. Benjamin Johnson asks, did your survey include the Civil War encampments in what you were looking at across the property?
Mine have not. It's something I would be interested in doing later on down the line, but it's not something I have had the capacity to add into my survey just yet.
Let's see. Am I missing any other questions? Another question is, would the commute from Montpelier to Monticello be done on one horse?
It would probably have been done, they probably would have ridden on astride, riding on the horse, but they probably would have had enslaved horsemen carrying belongings on horseback as well.
Would that have been, would men just ridden astride, or would women?
Oh, women would not have ridden astride. They would have ridden side saddle.
Okay, so not in carriages. They would have.
They would have in carriages, yes, but as far as I've seen in terms of the route to and from Monticello, would have been, at least as far as I've seen, would have been better ridden without carriage because of the roads at the time. But I think over the course of history, the roads got a little better. But I remember reading, I think it was actually a Monticello reference to the roads being kind of rough and so better to ride astride.
Excellent. Jerome's got his hand up. Jerome, a scare question.
I'm wondering about whether it be Monticello or Montpelier or other plantations about sending the horse meat to the enslaved population. I'm wondering if they were not doing that because at that age of the horse, the meat wouldn't be tasty or something of that sort. Wondering what they're doing in Europe, because in like France, where they do eat, I believe they still eat horse. If they're finding that an older horse is not as palatable.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we have not found any reference to people consuming horses at Montpelier in any capacity. And you would think that if they were consuming the horses, that we would find some evidence of their remains in and around trash middens or, you know, in other deposited areas, but we haven't had any evidence for it. And it's not to say that it's not possible, but just so far, nothing yet.
I know there was horse remains at Belle Grove in the enslaved mitten there.
Really? I would love
with,
to know more.
with salt, with cut marks on it and things like that.
Really? Okay, I'm gonna talk to Matt Greer about getting that data, because that's the first we have, I think, of, unless I'm wrong, Barney, first we have of an enslaved context with horse remains. But I'd love to know more about that, so I'll talk to Matt Greer about it.
And just kind of things happening in the chat. The Farmington Hunt does not practice feeding the horses to the hounds, but Sally is willing to get you in contact with them.
Yes.
Tom Chapman shares that the DuPont era hounds were kenneled on Chicken Mountain, and maybe that would be a good place to test your theory about feeding the horses.
That would be great.
Let's see. Talks about horsehair cushions showing up in Friends meeting houses in 1811. At the bottom, I'm curious about how the other material culture, how much has been found from the late 18th and early 19th century and what it is. So kind of the other components.
Yeah, so that's kind of the problem with my talk, is that I still haven't done the material culture analysis of the horse stuff at Montpelier. That's hopefully going to happen this spring. So we know that there were horseshoes, iron saddle trees, which I can only imagine how that would have felt on a horse's back. There were stirrups, horseshoe nails, horseshoes, oxen shoes, lots of chains, and kind of like buckles and attachments and things that would have attached to the harnesses. But it's something that I really am curious about, and I'm curious about understanding if we can pinpoint if these items were being made on property by the enslaved blacksmiths, or were they being brought in or from local estates, local towns. Not really sure yet. So that's something I'm going to look into. I'm hoping to do a little iron testing on it and see if we can figure out some more about the type of iron that some of this horse tack is, and see if that was being produced on property or not. So it's something I still want to know so much more about, and I'm doing a lot of blacksmithing research right now. So it's kind of dense stuff, but it's something that I'm working on getting into this spring.
Well,
so stay tuned.
Lucky for you, we dug 2 blacksmith shops recently and have tons and tons and tons of used horseshoe nails, for sure, where you can see that they've been clipped. Horseshoe fragments, all sorts of other things that could be related to the 2 sites in the home farm that some of the folks on this chat helped us dig at, both of which had evidence of farrier activity happening, not just, and blacksmithing happening during the 19th century. So, and
I can't wait.
Becca in particular conserved a lot of that stuff. So
thank you, Becca.
We've got a lot of that. Let's see. Tom Chapman asked, Madison was buried on a horsehair cushion. Do I remember that correctly? I don't know the answer, but Matt says, I don't know. I'm looking at Hillary to see if she has a nod or not.
I seem to remember it being a turkey red cushion, but I can check.
Excellent. Any other questions, either in the chat or anybody's got a hand up? One last question. You can just say it, Jessica.
Meeting. I just wondered what evidence of I know you've pinpointed where the stables were the original. Is there any further information about the plan of the stables or information about the original stables?
Yeah, so Matt might be better to jump in if there are any plans for the stable, but as far as I know, this was before my time at Montpelier, but there were landscape surveys with metal detector, and they found just an enormous amount of horse-related material. And there's actually a TV series called Diggers that was filmed all about the Montpelier stable, and it's on YouTube for free if anybody wants to watch it. But they had a whole team of metal detectorists out there, and they did some preliminary survey. They also did pH, phosphorus, and resistivity survey on the stable, and found like some evidence of high pH and phosphorus in the soil chemistry in some areas, which might indicate horse waste. And then they also I'm not sure. I don't think a footprint was ever found of the stable itself. I believe they were it was a log stable as far as we know. But it is, yes, there was also a map of the stable. Thank you, Terry.
Yeah, we didn't find any structural remains of the stable, but from the artifact patterns, there is a blank area amongst the debris field of accoutrement of saddles that indicated where the structure was. We still want to rebuild it. There.
All right. Well, I don't know if unless Jerome, you had another question, or is your hand just still up from before? But
actually, can I ask, where was that footprint? Like, where on the property do you think that stable was?
It's right behind the visitor center, and there's a little plaque where the stable is today.
Have you read the book Horse?
Yes, it's so good.
We've got one more question from Carolyn.
Oh, yes.
Did horseshoe nails shape change over the years? I mean, can you date some evidence, archaeological evidence by shape of horseshoe nails?
Well, I'm gonna find out. It's something. Nails change over time, so we can get that. But horseshoe nails stayed pretty consistent. There might be a little change here and there, and I'm gonna see if at Montpelier we have any kind of evidence of that. But for right now, not super sure about horseshoe nails. I'm interested to see if horseshoes, even though they stayed pretty consistent, I'm interested to see like thickness, how they changed over time, number of holes for nail holes. There were certain kind of additions to horseshoes that could be added because every horse's hoof is different, and so the shoe has to be catered to the horse in particular as an individual. And so I'm interested to see kind of if we can see some of these modifications to the horseshoes, and that would just go to further show the expertise of the blacksmiths. And so yeah, all these questions are things that I'm hoping to really dive into when I get into the material culture analysis. So that's great. I'll definitely put nails on there as well.
I would definitely say from the nails, we have a size range
Ooh.
That would correlate with the range of the horse sizes.
Okay, yeah.
So looking at like the size of the head, smaller for like correlate more with the thoroughbreds, larger with more with the workhorses. So I think, but we haven't done a quantitative analysis of those of comparing them. Oh, Wendy points out corrected wedge shoes are in the Monticello collection.
I just saw that, writing that down right now.
And Wendy's a volunteer in the lab here and did field school at Monticello. So
that's awesome to know. Thank you.
Got great connections. Well, I don't want to keep us too much longer past 1, but I do want to take the opportunity to do a couple of things. One is to plug some programs and events that are coming up. One, the very lovely Jerome Bias, who was asking questions, is running a really exciting and special program for us in April, where you will be doing hands-on hearth cooking with Jerome. We're going to be preparing meals, not only just like what the enslaved community would have eaten, but preparing meals like what Madison's would have been eating, and not only cooking, but you're eating, which is really exciting. It's a special 3-day program, and I haven't even told Jerome this, but yesterday I spent about an hour going through the house with our collections manager, figuring out how to do a special tour where you'll be moving through the house as the enslaved domestic workers would have moved through. And so getting that experience of carrying heavy things up narrow stairways and moving through the house in a really different way. So lots of really cool hands-on experiences. We have a few spots left in that program, so sign up, sign up, sign up. We also will be sending out soon more information about lunch and learns throughout the spring. In March, I will be doing one that's going to correlate when our lab expedition is. I think we have maybe 1 or 2 spots left in our lab expedition if anyone is interested. So I'll be talking about artifact conservation in March. So look in your inboxes for that. We've got some cool talks coming up from past employees in April and hopefully in May as well. And We also have most of our spring dig programs are full. Again, there's 1 or 2 spots left. So if you want to come dig with us this spring, make sure you sign up. There are still spots in our fall programs, and we are still taking applications for our summer field school. So if you know a college student or a recent graduate interested in field school, get them to apply. We're accepting applications until the 1st of March. So spread the word that way. Lots of exciting things are happening at Montpelier, and we'll keep you updated on them. Matt, do you have any other updates? Anything I missed?
No, that's great, Mary. Thank you so much for doing this lunch and learn, Liz. It was great to have you back.
Yes.
It was great to be here.
It's wonderful. We all learned so much, and I can't wait to get you back on site so I can pull artifacts for you to look at. So whenever you're ready, I'm here. The lab's waiting for you.
Sounds good.
So nice to see you again, Liz.
You too. It's so great to see everybody. Thank you so much for coming.
Great job, Liz. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Thanks, Liz.